going, I think. Good to see a good attendance for this event. My name is Michael Mason. I'm Director of the Middle East Centre here at LSE. This event is hosted by Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE and the Middle East Centre. I have to say my colleagues in Contemporary Turkish Studies have done all the hard work in organising the event, so I thank them. Professor Yaprak Gürsoy and Azu Koca Şahin, thank you very much for your work. I get the easy part, which is just chairing and enjoying the event, so I'm looking forward to it. This event, I better say what the title is in case some of you are in the wrong room, hopefully not. The event, The Civil War in Syria, Prospects for Peace and the Role of External Actors. And the panel, in summary, I'm sure most of you have probably seen the summary text of the event, is looking at the possibilities of a settlement in Syria and the role of regional global powers in that settlement with a particular focus on Turkey. This event is a hybrid event, so welcome to you online as well as those here in person. What will happen in a minute, I'll introduce our three distinguished speakers tonight. Each will speak for 15 minutes and then we'll have a discussion. We've got plenty of time for discussion. After they've spoken, we'll open the floor to questions. Okay, questions are also open to those who are online. If you're online, please post your questions in the question and answers box, not the chat box. Okay, you can make other comments if you want in the chat box, but we'll look for questions in the question and answer box. So I'll introduce first the three speakers. Each of the three speakers has been asked to present in response to a question, and we'll base their initial kind of discussion on that question. I'll read the question before each of the speakers in turn starts. Okay, you'll see how they're connected. So to our speakers. On my immediate left here is my colleague, Dr. Reem Turkmani. She's a senior policy fellow at the LSE Middle East Centre and LSE Ideas. She's principal investigator of the Legitimacy and Civicness in the Arab World research project funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Her research is centered around legitimate governance in the Middle East, local conflict, and peace drivers and the role of society in conflict zones. She's produced wide-ranging research on the lack of democracy and persistent violent conflicts in the Arab world, with a focus on the Levant. Next to her is our next distinguished guest, Dr. Salih Özel. Okay. So can we make an honorary doctor's there then, yeah? Yes. Fine. By the powers of LSE, Salih Özel is a senior lecturer at Istanbul Kadir University and a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, with a BA in Economics from Bender College and an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University. In 2021-22, he was a fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Özel is an accomplished writer and commentator, contributes to publications like the Deutsche Welle Turkish, Politikio, and Gazette Jua TV. He's co-authored Elite Origins of Development and Democracy with Michael T. Watt, published by Routledge in 2023. And at the end, Celine Nassi is a visiting fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Ankara Policy Centre's London representative. She's a political scientist with a focus on Turkey's Israel policy post-Cold War. She holds a 2021 PhD from Boğaziçi University and has contributed to various media outlets, including Politikio and Hürriyet Early News. Her recent co-authored work, which is particularly relevant for tonight's event, How the Syrian War Shifted the Balance of Power in Turkish-Israeli Relations, and that's featured in the book Israeli-Turkish Relations in Comparative Perspective 2019. Those are our three speakers. Before I turn to them, can you join me please in welcoming them to LSE? So we will go in the order as published, which is Reem, Salih, and then Celine. And each of these speakers is going to take 15 minutes. Please wait with your questions. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions until all the speakers have spoken. Okay, that's how we'll do it. So I'll pass over first to Reem. Reem's question. These questions are pitched to our guests, kind of get the discussion going, as it were. Her question is, in the context of peace settlement efforts, what's the current status and evolution of the Syrian Civil War? And who are the key players actively involved in conflict resolution? Reem, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. So it has been now 13 years since very, very brave civic actors in Syria went down to the street to challenge a very oppressive and violent regime. Since then, the events took many turns and got increasingly more complex, but whatever it is, it's not just a civil war. There is certainly a Syrian element to it, Syrian fighting, but there were external actors from the start, and more joined the party as things went on. More non-state actors have been formed, each supported by different external actors. And this not only became not just a civil war, this became suddenly not even a Syrian war. We just couldn't find ourselves within this war anymore because the external role was so predominant, especially around maybe 2013, 14, 16, and years after. So while this event is today is focused on the external role, but my role is to talk about the conflict itself. I'm going to try and bring to you how this external role is felt by ordinary Syrians, how is it felt on the ground, and bring some examples of how this role was played, sometimes to make things worse, sometimes to make things better. And what could be done? Now we know that fragmentation and complexity are characteristics of the Syrian conflict, and one of the reasons is the very complex external role coming from different sides around the table, but also the use of non-state actors, particularly non-state armed actors, as a foreign policy tool. We're seeing this increasingly now being played out by many states, but particularly the more illegitimate a state is, the more it is likely to use a non-state actor in another country as a foreign policy tool. And Iran is a master of this in particular, but it's not only Iran that played this in Syria. So that added to the complexity of the conflict. The other reason why it's so complex is that it is being played at different levels at the same time. So at the international level, we have the American-Russian polarization, there is a regional conflict projected on the Syrian one. And there is, of course, the intra-Syrian one between different actors, different regions. And there is also conflict at the very micro level. And that also reflects on the solutions, because you want to talk about the peace efforts, you find them also at kind of multiple levels. But before talking, so I'm going to talk about all these different tracks, but before going there, I just want to say that I personally distinguish between two different approaches to the Syrian conflict, no matter who you are, state, non-state, at what level. I see two different approaches in how you see this conflict and how do you come up with a solution. What do you think? One that sees the people as concerned about the people on the ground, concerned about their well-being, and they see everything through what is it going to do to the people, what is it going to mean to them, any policy, any intervention, how is it going to be felt by the people, how can we help the people who want to drive more democratic reform, peaceful change. And there also, the second approach is more focused on the regime. It's all the regime. Regime is either there or not there. It's going to fall or not fall. And intervention is also framed in terms of its impact on the regime. The problem with this approach is often, first of all, the policies that you come up with, if you focus only on the regime, you may intend to hurt the regime, but actually you're hurting the people. And the broad sanctions is one example, the broad economic sanctions, when they were imposed. I'm not talking about the personal one or the one that target the oppressive institutes, but the one that affects the broad economy. So initially they were designed to hurt the regime. but no one thought it was going to be felt by the people. If your starting point was the people on the ground, you would know that they will feel the impact of the sanctions before anyone else. Same for army opposition. And it really was done to hurt the regime, but very little thoughts have been given to what is it going to mean for civilians on the ground as army groups are roaming the civilian areas. But as things moved on, there were several tracks, also solution tracks, working on the same time. And I'll just start first with the track one solution, which is the UN one, the Geneva one, that started almost 13, 14 years ago. It started with a strong mandate with the big names as mediators, Kofi Annan, and as the moved on, it got weaker and weaker. I mean, we lost the momentum, the mandate coming from the UN, the tools given by UN also got weaker and weaker. And it also sadly, it's hindered by the fact that the most important actor to play a role in this is the regime, and is unwilling to participate, unwilling to give anything meaningful in these talks. And of course, it's also hindered by its dependency on the Russian-American consensus, which looks even more likely now because of the conflict in Ukraine. But there are two off tracks that stemmed out of that UN track, which I'd just love to talk about, because we were involved as a LSE team actually in designing these tracks. And these are mechanisms to introduce the contribution of civil society to the UN track. That resulted in two mechanisms. One is called the Civil Society Support Room, that brings civil society from all over the country to sit and talk about all the same issues being discussed on the top table and put solutions on the table. And the second one is the Women Advisory Board, which is a bit similar, but for women only. And these two mechanisms, I know them very well. I was a member of the Women Advisory Board. There's so much focus on the people. So everything that came out of them was actually completely different, but it remained kind of not very well known. No one sees it as very important. But most importantly, it was outside the intervention of external actors. And that was the best thing about it. This is why we were sitting in the room, like, myself and many other women coming from completely different backgrounds. Some of them Kurds, some of them very loyalists, some of them are extreme opposition. And we agreed on so many things that can be, there are concrete solutions we came up with, but no one would listen, of course. But what I want to say is that examples show that when Syrians are sitting together to bring a solution, they can do something without the intervention. Now, if you go down a little bit to a lower level, we had more mental level tracks that more bring the regional to the international together, like the Asipana track, the cessation of hostility tracks, and there's so many issues with these tracks, deep issues, but they were more concrete than the UN one. They were more, they brought together the relevant countries to bring cessation of hostilities in particular area. They put the relevant armed actors, the people who were vetoed, in Geneva, and they delivered something on the ground. Regardless, I was against them, I didn't like them, but they were more concrete, and they were more controlled by Russia and Iran and Turkey, but they were able to deliver outside the UN table. Now, we prefer the UN table because we know that eventually the solution has to bring everyone on board, and UN table is the only one that can bring everyone on board. So despite that the process right now is hopeless in Geneva, but we hope at some point there will be more momentum, because that's the only table that can bring on everyone. Now, if you go on the lower level, there will be the more like Syrian solutions, or what looks like Syrian solutions. And there was a series of local agreements that started in Syria more than 12 years ago. And they were, when they fed up with the UN track, they started themselves drafting solutions between different areas, different regions, and in every area there would be two different agendas. One mainly driven by the locals, trying, including the areas where the most violent. In my city, in Homs and Ghouta, everywhere when you zoom and you will find that no matter how it is from the outside, there will be groups on the ground, actually from both sides, reaching out to each other and drafting solutions and putting very, very powerful plans on the table. And I will come back to these agreements later on. And there's also a lot of work on the micro level. But right now, despite all these cracks, there is a miserable situation in the, okay, there's not much violence, like before, the violence has subsided a lot, but the economy deteriorated, the humanitarian suffering is unspeakable. People talk about slow death, they say it's even much more difficult now than it used to be during the very violent kind of period. The powers that asked the regime to kind of step down early in the conflict, including the US, all of Europe, Saudi, many of them, because they framed it as the regime either stay or goes, you know, for them, well, the regime stayed, so maybe it won't. I don't see, if you look at from, if you focus on the people, you don't see that the regime has won, because we know when you talk to people that the regime is losing the leverage on the ground. Even of its very loyal supporters now are not supporters anymore. Are very frustrated. But if you see it as like he stayed or not, well, he stayed. So people lost hope in political solutions. So Syria is not seen as a political problem anymore. It's seen as a humanitarian one. It's seen as a source of refugee problem and in counterterrorism. Even the US, you know, like the 4 top priorities for the US for the Syria policy, they don't involve supporting political solutions, not even the Geneva one. They're humanitarian, counterterrorism, accountability. So what is keeping the country afloat despite all of this? A little bit of humanitarian aid and remittances. There are about $6 to $7 billion every year is going into Syria by the Syrian diaspora. But remittances, maybe they keep people afloat, but they don't drive the economy. So they are not solution themselves. There is also civil society, and there is very neglected business community that we will go back to a bit later that is also keeping the country afloat. In my last few minutes, I want to talk about 2 things that have to do with the external roles. And these are kind of 2 areas of research I started. One is the changing nature and tools of external interventions as experienced in the Syrian conflict. And the external role is not just anymore of in civil wars, I'm talking here, or in this complex conflict. External role is not just anymore played at the very, very top level. It's not, can't just see it at the through the IR lens, and it's between different states. As I said, there are non-state actors, the financing of arming, the logistics, the arming the actors themselves. In the case of Turkey, the control of the border itself is a mean of intervention. Who do they decide is going to control the border on the other side? Who do they allow to go through the borders is a mean of intervention. But one interesting thing we've seen in the Syrian conflict is that when time comes for a local agreement to be reached, all these tools are now used again as leverage by these external actors to shape this agreement. So I spoke about the locals having almost in every area. I looked at local agreements almost in all of Syria. In every area, you will find a very local agreement, like truly driven by the people of the area. And then comes in the last minute, there will come a completely different agreement driven by external actors that really serves external agenda. And all these tools, the toolbox of external interventions will be used to shape these local agreements. And they just look horrendous, the results of these agreements, because of this intervention, like the case of the 4-town agreement, which Turkey played a strong role in. For example, there was like a population swap. There's lots of identity cleavages that were played on. The Kurdish issue has been also used as a card through these interventions. In Al-Ghouta and Aleppo, we've seen this, especially by Turkey and by Iran, this role being played. They, like, as a grand country, sits on a very local table and negotiates what is a very local agreement and shaping the situation on the ground. The second thing, which is the last one I want to talk about, is the economic interventions. And sorry, just one point about these local agreements is usually when there is multilateral actors playing a role in these agreements, the agenda goes more towards the local. So my view is that, you know, the UN or multilateral actor needs to be playing more on top level, not just stay up there on a very, very ground level. On the economic intervention, you have 2 main things: the frameworks of humanitarian interventions or aid, the frameworks of aid. So in case of Europe and the US, this is still mainly humanitarian. which is a big issue. I mean, Syria is not a humanitarian crisis, it's a political one. And if you continue to see things as a humanitarian, then you're only resolving an instant issue. You don't see a future. You're sending a political signal to the people that there is no hope, there is no solution. We can't see further. And that's very bad. That's actually reflecting on people's willingness to stay in the country. They don't see a future. Many people want to leave. Even if they're very well off. The second thing that's really last thing is economic sanctions. And their impact, particularly on the business community. So Syria was like 60% of the GDP was contribution by SME sector, small medium enterprise. There's very, very well established business community, manufacturing community, agri-food, textile, others. And these are the guys who are driving the economy. It's not the big guys very close to the regime. No, it's these guys. They were employing 60% of the Syrian people. Because of these sanctions, because of many other, of course, the regimes, issues coming from the side of the regime, most of these guys are not able to conduct their business anymore, and therefore they're not able to drive the economy, they're not able to provide legitimate jobs for people and keep them in the country, keep the hope that there will be solution. Because if we want to restore people's dignity, that's what people asked for in 2011, we have to start with a legitimate, dignified livelihood, not just keep them dependent on humanitarian aid. I just came today from Italy. I was in a 2 days meeting with the business community in Syria, and it was organized by Italy and Japan, because we've been advocating focusing back on this community to help them so they can help the society, not just completely taken by them. I mean, this mantra, like, don't teach them, don't give them a fish, teach them how to fish. They were like, no, we don't want to fish. We don't want even to be told how to fish. We know it, we know how to do it. Just let us fish for adults, allow us to do it. Because we want to do it, we can't export, we can't import, nobody wants to talk to us. We can't bring the accessories needed to fix our factories, they're just paralyzed. So those who manage to survive, despite all the odds, I think they deserve to be supported, because as I said, not only that would help drive the economy, strengthen the society against the regime, but also it gives hope and open the door for more solutions.
Thank you very much, Reem. That's an excellent overview, which I'm sure has suggested questions to you. As I said at the start, we just hold on to the questions, try and remember them. And now we go to Solly Özal. And Solly's question to respond to set up the discussion and commentary is, how has Turkey's Syria policy evolved since the onset of the Syrian war, and what are the prospects for normalization between Turkey and Syria? Over to you, Solly.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about Turkey, but just to add a few things to what Reem has already said in an excellent presentation. I think, especially if we're going to talk about the Syrian crisis today, we should take into account when that crisis began. Because increasingly, I think we have to analyze the Syrian crisis not only in the context of the Arab revolts of which it was a part, but also the incredible impact, disorderly impact, chaotic impact of the American war in Iraq, which was one beginning of the parenthesis, opening of the parenthesis, and now the Gaza war, which I think is going to be the closing of the parenthesis. When the parenthesis closes, I don't know what kind of hell we're going to end up with, but that we're going to end up with either hell, or if God decides to give us a miracle, after all, this is the Holy Land, maybe something will come out of a crisis that now is 21 years old, or if you take it from 9/11, 23 years old. From the beginning, I think, and Turkey is as guilty as any other party in committing these errors, mistakes, sins, miscalculation, misjudgment, malfeasance, pusillanimity, abrasiveness, have all played their part in the kind of mess that Syria is in today. And one final introductory note The Syrian crisis is also, or the Syrian crisis had evolved in such a brutal way. Yes, of course, because of the nature of the regime and what it was capable of doing, and it had no qualms about doing it. But also it was a function of a climatic crisis, of which we will see many more examples. Between 2006 and 2011, 4 out of the 5 years in Syria were years of drought. 65% of the harvest was gone. Over 800,000 animals were slaughtered, and 1 million people moved from their villages to wherever the hell they went, and that's already 5% of the entire country's population. And it was also a failure of the international system that, however, whether you like the Syrian regime or not, they did apply to the UN, asked for some kind of attention, and the UN system just was indifferent to it. And other countries as well, when they get reports from their diplomats, just didn't particularly care. That I think explains to a certain extent the fury. Now, for Turkey, the trajectory in terms of the policy vis-a-vis Syria is one that moved from a soft power approach to a transformation to securitization of Turkish foreign policy vis-a-vis Syria, and now the militarization of it, or the hard power driven approach to it. To be truthful, Turkish-Syrian relations were never a love affair. Mostly because the Syrians never really digested the fact that Turkey got Alexandretta or Hatay for us. Huh?
Yeah, with
of course, there was also the fact that I don't think the Turkish successive Turkish government particularly liked Ba'ath Syria run by Nusayri's. Okay. And to be truthful, although Turkey's usual policy vis-a-vis the Middle East was one of non-interference in domestic affairs, and definitely non-interference in intra-Arab affairs, when in 1976 the Syrian Civil War, the first civil war, broke, which ended with Hama, I think the Turkish government at the time, particularly the military rulers of 1980, did aid the Muslim Brotherhood. A friend of ours have already gotten that the tracks that are used for the jihadi highway today were the exact tracks that were used back in 1979, 1980 to help the MB people would go in and out through those routes. And then in return, of course, al-Assad, the great humanitarian leader, decided to support Turkey's nemesis, the PKK. And I mean, I wish I were a fly on the wall at the time, you know. Turkish has prime minister or the foreign minister or the interior minister would go to Damascus and tell Assad to return Öcalan to Turkey, and said, who is this guy? So then he lives in Damascus, said, no. And then they would give him the telephone number and the address, and then he put it in his pocket and the conversation would continue. Anyway, all of that ended when there was pressure on Turkey put on Damascus. Damascus let Öcalan go. And then the Americans, as a New Year's gift, delivered in Kenya the leader of the PKK to the Turks, who was actually in the Greek embassy holding a Greek Cypriot passport, which was also an interesting detail. Anyway, then there was something called the Adana Agreement, and the relations really began to move forward. And so we moved and the thing is, it was a state policy. So I mean, the AKP likes to take credit for everything that's good, but the rapprochement with Syria investment in that rapprochement actually began a lot earlier. A very EP leader of the president of Turkey at the time went to Hafez al-Assad's funeral in 2005 after the murder of Hariri. He still visited Damascus. I mean, he still visited Syria, went to Damascus and Aleppo. Therefore, the Turkish foreign policy vis-a-vis Syria was one that wanted to have much more influence over Syria by using soft power aspects. And I would argue, since this came after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, this was also partially to balance Iranian influence in Syria. And I have no idea whether or not Turkey's Western partners exactly understood that that's what Turkey was trying to do. Okay. So, and then relations got really much, much better, you know, vacations together, my brother Assad, hugs and kisses and stuff. And therefore, in 2011, when the Arab Spring finally hit Syria, at first the Turkish government was protective of the regime. But thinking, okay, now we have some leverage over them, so why don't we suggest that they take in a few MB, Muslim Ikhwan people into the government, which I would say was a big misjudgment, to say the least. Okay. Then things have deteriorated, but I also think that the Turkish policy then took a turn. A turn towards, if you want to call it neo-Ottomanism or neo-Islamism, but the assessment of Turkish authorities at the time was that the Arab revolts would end up with some kind of elections everywhere, and those elections would deliver Ikhwani governments everywhere. And Turkey would be the natural leader of a string of Ikhwan governments everywhere, and that will be, if you will, kind of a reversal of the Sykes-Picot system or that was established in the Middle East over 100 years, about 100 years earlier. That, of course, did not happen because first, the revolts were crushed in some places, and where they seem to have succeeded, like in Egypt, there was a counter-revolution sustained by the Gulf regimes, conservative Gulf regimes. And in the meantime, Turkish investment in non-governmental armed organizations and all that actually got Turkey into some kind of trouble. And the truly delusional or miscalculation of opening the borders, thinking that you could stem the tide and then actually return those refugees back, gave us about 4 million refugees with whom we really don't know what to do, although that's not correct, because they're cheap labor. And arguably, this is also what sustained the Turkish economy to a certain extent in the past few years. Another miscalculation on the part of the Turkish government, I think, was to count on the United States to actually resort to armed intervention after the 2012 elections. I think this was also a misreading of Obama in particular, who really wanted to have anything to do with these guys. And that really dawned on everyone when after chemical weapons were used in Ghouta, at the last moment, the American president decided to ask Congress whether he should attack Syria, knowing full well that Congress had no stomach for that. So that left Turkey, if you will, all alone on the field. And by that time, Turkish-Saudi relations also soured because the Saudis were the counter-revolutionaries in Egypt, and Turkey continued to support the Brotherhood. Fast forward, then we had the very critical turning point of Kobani. When Kobani was besieged by ISIS, if I were a decision maker in Turkey, I would send the troops in, fight ISIS, settle there, and nobody would ask why Turkey was actually in Syrian territory. Instead, I think that the government waited for Kobani to fall so that the PKK-affiliated PYD-YPG would be eliminated. And that led to a move on the part of the United States to support when the relation turned from one of strategic calculations to one of counterterrorism. the United States then started supporting the Kurdish PYD-YPG, which then soured Turkish-American relations further until today. I'll end up with a speculation on that score in a moment. Then that also is the beginning, if you will, along with the elections of 2015 inside Turkey, of turning from a neo-Ottomanist or pan-Islamist vision of foreign policy towards the Middle East to one that is much more securitarian and far more nationalistic, which means it put the Kurdish issue at the center of decision-making vis-a-vis all of Turkey's foreign policy moves. And that was hardened in 2016 when, thankfully, unsuccessful coup attempt, for which the Turkish authorities held the United States somewhat responsible. Even if they were not responsible, I'm also among those who wonder why couldn't somebody pick up the phone and call the legitimately elected prime minister or president of Turkey when a coup was ongoing. It was 2:30 in the afternoon in Washington, and that is not really explicable to me in any reasonable way, which then, of course, put oil to the flames of suspicion about US intentions all along inside Turkey, and then the turn towards Russia. And with the turn towards Russia, Turkey got exactly what it wanted, that is the right to intervene in Syria. And it did so 4 times. And when it wanted to do so the 5th time, this time it really didn't get any support from anyone, which because some limits were actually set. Today, finally, I think there is another possibly major shift is occurring in Turkish foreign policy vis-a-vis Syria, and this one entails the United States as the 4th major actor in Syrian politics. There is talk about American withdrawal from the Northeast, and they are the ones who sustain the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, the core of which, of course, is the Kurds, and then the Kurds and the Arab tribes with which they're associated had actually a good going fight a few months ago. My hunch is that if the United States will withdraw, it will withdraw after the elections, Trump or Biden, and they would have to make sure that when they leave, the void that we leave behind will either be filled with a trusted actor, and I'm not really sure whether or not they're willing to push the Kurds under the bus. And the Kurds, of course, have their own hedges. You know, they have signed agreements with the regime. They are in Aleppo along with the Iranian forces and stuff. But after the accession of Sweden's accession to NATO issue has settled, there is a major move forward in ameliorating and normalization of Turkish-American relations. And you can see this attempt to normalize relations with almost every actor in the Middle East as well. So if Turkey and the United States also come to an agreement over what should happen in the Northeast once the United States, American troops leave, that will be not a surprise. But again, for the moment, for me, this is just sheer speculation, but also based on the fact that just last week, Turkish foreign minister and the intelligence chief were both in Washington, and I suppose this was an item on their agenda. To finish, the American war in Iraq, contrary to the expectations of the miscalculating neocons, instead of finishing off the Iranian regime, made Iran the most powerful country in the region. And because perhaps the Iranian regime is also under a lot of pressure domestically, it is really pushing the boundaries of what it can do. Which means that with Gaza, the issue of Iran and what to do with Iran, short of war, of course, with Iran, may come to be at the center of the questions that need to be answered. And that will be the most important challenge if the Gaza war leads to not hell, but maybe to the springing of a more hopeful future.
Thank you very much, Solly. Again, plenty of material that we think about all over, and you think about asking your questions. Lastly, Celine. Celine asked these questions we've asked her to respond to of her commentary. Is one of the factors driving the rapprochement between the Arab states and the Bashar al-Assad regime, and what will be the implications of renewed relations for the Syrian conflict? Over to you, Spain.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everyone. I will first talk about the drivers of this process and then reflect on the regional implications. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's rehabilitation in the Middle East reflects changing priorities of the actors involved in the Syrian conflict. Countries which poured in money and weapons to support a regime change in Syria have come to terms with the fact that Assad effectively won the war. Some consider this as a pyrrhic victory. It is true that Assad controls only parts of Syria and that he presides over a war-torn, broken state. But still, he managed to remain in power, and thanks to support from Iran and Russia. And other players in the region are basically adjusting their policies to this new reality on the ground. Domestic politics are also at play here. Oil kingdoms like Saudi Arabia have been preparing themselves for a post-oil age. They want to channel their attention and resources and energy into economic reconstruction and modernization efforts, which requires avoiding unnecessary military adventures abroad. So the US disengagement from the Middle East also factors in the process. The perceived US retreat from the region has been compelling US allies in the region to look out for themselves, to find settlements to conflicts on their own, assuming that Washington would not come to their aid in the case of a military conflict, as it happened in 2019 when Iran attacked Saudi Arabia's oil wealth. So when we look at developments from 2021 onwards, such as the Gulf Cooperation Council's decision to lift the blockade over Qatar, or the Gulf countries seeking a settlement in Yemen, or more recently, Saudi Arabia's rapprochement with Iran thanks to Chinese mediation. All of these developments indicate a willingness to de-escalate tension. And restoring ties with the Assad regime only completes the picture. We have various players with different expectations they're hoping to obtain from normalizing their relations with Damascus. One of the most pressing issues is the refugee problem. For countries like Jordan and Turkey, it has become a huge economic burden. The change of social fabric in Turkey has fueled xenophobia and posed security problems as well. It has become a heated debate in domestic politics. The opposition has been very much critical about the ruling party's refugee policy, and so much so that it forced the government to change tack. So countries in the region are hoping to repatriate some of their Syrian refugees back to the country. However, it is questionable whether or not this is a realistic goal, especially if we're talking about voluntary return of the refugees. There is a reason why Syrians left in the first place, and there needs to be a minimum level of security and stability established in Syria, and we need to see some economic improvement so that they can start a new life if they return. And the other important topic is the captagon flow. Let me briefly explain. Captagon is an amphetamine used to fight depression. However, it turned into a weapon of mass addiction and has become a huge headache for the Gulf countries. There are allegations that captagon is widely produced in the laboratories in Syria, and it is run by the Assad country, Assad family, excuse me. So other countries who suffer from this captagon trade are hoping to convince Assad to slow down this captagon trade, and maybe if they get closer and through some economic cooperation, maybe Assad would give up captagon trade as an income, as a source of income. So this is what they hope, and it looks like a fool's errand, but still is a very important issue they want to address. The third one is a geopolitical one. Sunni Arab countries are hoping to curtail Iran's power over Syria through restoring their ties with the Assad regime. Again, from my perspective, it looks like a tall order because Iran invested a lot in Syria. Iranian affiliated officials, militias, you name them, have been installed in various positions in the military and the government. So this is a process that cannot be easily undone. And having said that, of course, rich oil kingdoms have got the economic means to at least balance Iran's influence over Syria. But we have no signs coming from Damascus that that Assad is ready to give up or abandon Iran at the moment. But this is another issue that we are following closely. So moving to regional implications. Without a doubt, Assad's coming from the cold revamps his international standing. But in order for him to truly consolidate his legitimacy, there needs to be a political settlement. The West still treats Syria as a pariah state. Last month, the US House of Representatives passed a bill which blocks Washington from normalizing relations with the Assad regime, and the bill also extends the Caesar Sanction Act adopted in 2019 until 2032. On the other hand, Assad is finding other platforms to represent his country, and I'm not only referring to the Arab League here. He was welcomed by Chinese President Xi last year. But it also comes down to whether he would be able to receive the economic funds he badly needs to rebuild his country. One last thing, what does Assad's reintegration into the system mean for the future of the liberal democratic order? Well, Assad is one of the worst war criminals of the 21st century. He has imprisoned, tortured, and murdered thousands of his opponents. He used barrel bombs, chemical weapons on civilians. He turned several Syrian cities into rubble. And his return to the system from a humanitarian perspective is devastating. And it truly breeds the culture of impunity here. To wrap up, the Syrian conflicts today seems to be at a stalemate. Yet we may see some changes on the ground, as Soli mentioned, big if the United States withdraws its forces from Syria. But until then, Assad's breaking out of his isolation strengthens his hand and reinforces the perception that he is back for good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celine. I think you had there a fantastic high-level analysis of the situation. So I think hopefully we'll have all sorts of opportunities and interventions from the audience. We are going to alternate between questions from those of you in person here and online questions. I think we have a microphone to go around to people asking questions. I'll take the first questions from the floor here. We'll take 2 questions at a time. When you want to ask a question, please, if you can, just identify yourself, say who you are, and try and keep the question brief so we can get as many questions as possible. If you have an intervention to make, please make that even briefer. I mean, apart from the questions, let's see how we go. I've got a question online already, but let's see if we've got anybody in the audience first. If not, I'll take the one online first. Here. Take the microphone, yeah?
Nice one. My questions are what's on the regime's agenda. So previously the regime has said that they want all of Syria to be under its rule, and of course that's not realistic. I think it is quite a large population. I don't think there's the resources to control all of what it currently has, but I'm curious what you think is on its agenda, and also the extent to which it can pull the shots and even make that kind of decision. But idea was mentioned about Assad taking in aid in Gulf Arab countries. To what extent is he even free to do that if Iran is heavily entrenched inside the government of the country as well?
We'll just hold that question, yeah. And we have the second question here.
It's both question actually and also comment as well. I mean, rightly as Syrian had emphasized, the impact of the Gaza war on the prospect of Assad normalization. I would like to a bit deal with it, because it seems up until the Gaza war, the prospect was for Assad normalization was even stronger. But I think from Turkey's side also the elections, so once the election is done, the motivation for normalization has a bit lessened. But I feel like the Gaza war actually, because one idea for the Arab world was that Assad will come back to the Arab world, not being part of the axis of resistance. But if anything, since the Gaza war, the axis of resistance will stick together more. The Hezbollah, Assad, Iran, the Shia network in the region, and that's in a sense the idea that underpins the motivation of the Arab states to bring Iran, to bring Syria back into the Arab fold, in a sense, to reduce its presence in the axis of resistance. It seems that the Gaza war has actually undermined this. So probably this normalization effort, both by the Arab states but by Turkey, will lose some steam going forward.
Thank you very much. I'll open it up to any of our panelists to answer either.
Yeah.
question.
Let's start with the first one on what's the regime agenda with the agency. I mean, the agenda has been from the beginning to win power. That's number one. Or no matter what happens. But after that, I mean, they like to play a long game, and they think that everyone eventually is going to come back to them. Some people are coming back. And mainly because of pragmatic reasons. I mean, you can sit here outside in Europe and severe cut ties with the Syrian regime is not going to affect you much. But if you're the immediate neighbor, you can't do that for very long. The trade relations, the refugees, the kept going, there are pragmatic issues, real issues on the ground that require some sort of cooperation. So some of them are seeking renormalization, but they're not getting anything in return. They're being disappointed, not surprisingly. But I think the regime thinks that Turkey is going to come back as well, because negotiations are not only on the Northeast, not only happening between the US and other actors, but also between the what shall I call them? PYD or Syrian Democratic Forces, the guys up in the Northeast, the public authority in the Northeast of Syria, and the Syrian regime. And I think they think that eventually Turkey is going to come back and they're going to play one area against the other. So Northwest Syria, so Turkey will deliver Northwest Syria back to the regime. In return, the regime controls the Northeast, make sure to put the Kurds where Turkey wants them. That's what they think. And they also think that the fact that they keep their borders with Israel quiet is also another point of leverage, and that's kind of the source of agency. That's what they think. But how much they have power on the ground, it's kind of limited. It's not as much as people think, actually. As I said, I keep hearing stories from people inside the country, in government areas, how everyone is talking openly, how frustrated they are. The regime is unable to suppress the opposition anymore, like everyday casual opposition. I'm not talking here about political, big stuff. There's a huge level of frustration. I think we don't know exactly how it's going to play in the long run, but it also means that the regime cannot deliver. Just as like on the employment issue, it was it's unable to deliver on many other issues. Just one quick thing on normalization. I think Celine should answer the question, but my view is that all these countries in power, they should normalize with the Syrian people, not with the regime. The problem is that to access the people, sometimes you have to go not through the regime itself, but you may have to negotiate some access channels. Like if you want, for example, to support, let's say, small SMEs on the ground, you have to fund them. To fund them, you have to negotiate the mechanisms. You have to be able to access those people. And this is where we need to normalize, not with the regime itself.
Like to go first? Yeah, I'd like to answer the question, and I think Galip made a very important comment. Is it possible to bring Syria to the Arab fold, and how the Gaza war will play out and its implications? It is very important because this is a question that occupies my mind too. On the one hand, Syria, of course, in the worst case scenario, if we say Israel remains in Gaza, the window of opportunity is closing. We have a very narrow window of opportunity to come up with a settlement. I think the determining factor will be, in that case, humanitarian catastrophe worsens. Will the Abraham Accords remain intact or not? If that collapses, then Gulf countries would somehow, it will affect the rapprochement process between Syria and the Gulf countries. And in a way, they might compete for championing the Palestinian cause, but it will also unite them together in a sense. They will both compete for it, but at the same time, they will be rallying around this issue. So it is really important. But with regard to the implications of the Gaza war, it presents many risks for the Syrian regime because each and every day passes by and we cannot get to a settlement. We get closer to a regional conflagration, which Syria has already become a front in this proxy war. This is not a development that Bashar al-Assad should welcome, and it's not a desirable development. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, okay, I'm going to go to an online question now, and then we'll come back to the floor. Thank you. This is from Wasim Proyon. My name is Wasim, a Syrian American living in the US. This is to read, Dr. Tagmani. My question is, what leverage does Syria have to convince the US to remove US sanctions? And secondly, you can choose either of these questions, yeah? What steps must the Syrian government take to rebuild trust with the Syrian people? Does the Syrian government have any pathway to rebuild trust with Syrian citizens? Thank you.
Trust between
the Syrian government and the Syrian people.
Okay.
Thank you, Wasim, for the question.
Do you want to take another one?
No. Oh, okay. We'll take here at the back. We'll take one in person, then we'll come back to the room.
To what extent has Russia's invasion of Ukraine overshadowed Russia's influence in the crisis, and what are the prospects of Russia's continued influence in Syria? This is my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we'll take the answer to those two questions first.
Okay, I'll start with the one on the leverage and the sanctions. This meeting that was happened in Italy, it had like all the heads of all the private banks in Syria. And the big part of the business community. And you know, in the past, they used to say, oh, lift the sanctions. They don't say this anymore. They say, just apply the sanctions as they are. Because what's happening now is like a whole boycott of the whole country. Like the private banks themselves, they're not sanctioned. But then nobody wants to deal with them. It's the whole thing is a no. It's like blacked over the country. No one wants to go near that. Even the banks that were very transparent, they're doing all the international measure counterterrorism, everything. There's still no one wants to deal with them. So it's more what's now people are looking for, not exactly the lifting, because they know even if it's lifted, it's not going to have, no one's going to go and rule the country straight away. We've seen this in Iraq, we've seen it in many other countries. I mean, it's not a situation. What they want is to kind of find solutions to all these issues. How do you work with the intermediary bank? How do you find alternative solutions? I mean, very, very technical, detailed, but so they don't expect help in resolving these issues. Now, what can the Syrian regime give back? I mean, that would always be subject to negotiation. The problem is that what we would like, for example, when I talk about supporting the legitimate business community, that's not what the regime wants. The regime wants to support particular cronies. So, but one important thing here to bring is that trade relations bring leverage. And that I want to go back here on the issue of Iran and the impact of Iran. So before the war, Syria's trade was 37% of Syria's external trade was with Europe. With Russia and Iran combined was 6% only. Now, because of the sanctions, it's almost zero now with Europe, and most of it is with Iran. Now, with that, we lost leverage as Europe and the US as well. We lost leverage. So establishing some sort of economic relation also brings ability to come up, to bring impact, and you take the regime back from its allies. So one thing the sanctions did is that they really drove the regime further into Iran's lap, not only depending on them on export and import, but also on oil and on banking as well, and funds and all of that. So there's a strong external relation element here in that. And despite all the strength of the Iranian role in Syria, and the investment didn't start just after 2011. Despite all of that, I don't think that it cannot be undone or can be reduced. A lot of it can be reduced. I mean, if they are left on their own, they're going to occupy the space. So that space has to be occupied by other players. And the other good news is that there is resistance to their role inside Syria. I mean, the Syrian society, the people, they're not happy with their role because if they contrast it to the Russian role, for example, they say the Russian comes as an army, they do their job, they support the government, they support the army itself, the government and institutions, and they go. The Iranians don't do that. They don't support any government institution. The Iranians build their own institutions and they interfere with the Syrian identity. They want to convert people. They want to play. They have their own schools. They convert people to Shiism. So people don't like that, especially the allied community. So there's a resistance there. So it's not as deeply rooted as we think.
Thank you. And that leads nicely into the other question about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I would like to answer that question with reference to Turkey's military presence in Idlib and how, from my perspective, it contributes to the stalemate on the battlefield. Because we were talking about this with Saudi only yesterday. Ongoing military conflicts are very much intertwined. And this makes it harder to resolve them. It's almost like a Jenga play. You pull the wrong brick and then the tower collapses. Since Russia, with the war in Ukraine, wants to channel its resources to Ukraine, obviously, and wants to maintain some calm in Syria. And that's why it has been pushing normalization efforts between encouraging Syria and Turkey to normalize their relations, because it is not happy that the power vacuum left from Russia is being filled by Iran in Syria. So this is not a desirable development. However, Turkey's military presence in northern Syria obviously stands in the way of Turkey's normalization, diplomatic normalization with Syria. And again, because of the Ukraine war, Turkey provides an economic lifeline to Russia. It hasn't joined economic sanctions against Russia. In the Black Sea, Turkey is upholding the Montreux Convention, which everyone complains about, but there is no better alternative to it at the moment. So, for various reasons, I mean, Turkey also provides a hub for the travelers, Russian travelers. So, Russia cannot afford to lose Turkey, but Turkey's military presence is also creates vulnerability. The relationship between Turkey and Russia has always been asymmetrical. And on and off, Russia reminds Turkey that it is the one who's calling the shots in Syria, as it did in 2020 when the Syrian Air Force, coordinated with Russian forces, killed 36 Turkish soldiers. So yes, all the military conflicts, ongoing military conflicts, are very much intertwined, and so we need to see the bigger picture here when assessing the prospects for a settlement.
There was kind of a balance. Powers that were present in Syria basically took the matters from the Assad government's hands. That's why the Gaza war is important, because it is changing the way all these powers are dealing with one another. I don't know which direction that will all go, but there are things that cannot be controlled, and should, as some American commentators think, and Israel does wish to expand the war. If Hezbollah is engaged, then all bets are off, I think, everywhere. And of course, Syria will be part of that as well. So this is, I didn't particularly like Rumsfeld, but he gave us really a very good framework, right? Known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and unknown. I think this is the known unknown.
Thank you. So we'll go back to the floor. I can see, we'll take one question here, and I'll come, I can see two here. Actually, we'll do three together, yeah?
Okay, I can use my voice, probably.
Fine, if you yes, speak up.
Okay, I have two questions. Can I ask?
Sure, we'll see.
First question is, Iraq and Syria are affected by each other's political problems. And today, we may say that Iraq cares about Syrian economic and political challenges. To what extent developing economic relations between Iraq and Türkiye may affect Syria's economy in the future? And the other question, sorry. And the other question is, Syria is badly needed for economic rehabilitation in the region, and also Syria is under Iran's big influence in the region, and Iran and China are improving their economic ties. What can Syria do to overcome economic challenges? Can Assad focus more on China?
Thank you. And because I can see we've got a lot of time left, we take these last two. Thank you.
I want to ask Soledad to elaborate about Iran's role in Syria. Given the fact that Iran is likely to become more stabilizer or destabilizer factor in the region, not only in Syria but also in the Middle East in general, and especially for the stability of Israel. So the elephant in the room in the Middle East is Syria. So to what is Iran? To what extent actually, with the possible change in the US administration and Gaza war in Israel would actually make possible to deal with Iran for the external actors?
Thank you. And here?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Omar from Syria. My question is about the Turkish influence on the opposition of Syria during the negotiations, and also the control of areas in northern Syria. And my question is how the current actors that Turkey support in the opposition actually serve the Turkish interest in Syria, as they are not democratically elected by people, and they are just appointed. by people, and also the increased frustration in the areas outside of the control of the government due to the bad governance that those actors are doing in these areas. How does this serve the Turkish interest? And do you see a prospect to change on that, like more power to the people voices?
Thank you very much. I counted 4 questions there, so I would say, I mean, just pick any of those 4. We have a question around the world
You
economic
get to
relations.
choose the question, we would like
Yes,
to spread.
I will just summarize.
Say a few words on China's role.
Okay, yeah, sure.
In Syrian conflict. Well, since the outbreak of the war, China has aligned with Russia and worked together to block Western-led resolutions in the UN Security Council. It advocated for Syria's territorial integrity and criticized the role of external meddling in the conflict. Syria joined Belt and Road Initiative in 2022. A more recent development is Syria and China signed a strategic cooperation deal last year. So to return all these favors, Syria and the Assad regime has been silent on Uyghurs suffering in Xinjiang issue.
That's so humanitarian and really.
Yes. And they also they align with China on issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan. So see if China is willing to not only talk to talk, but also walk to walk with regard to this strategic partnership agreement. China, my understanding is that it sees Syria as a long-term investment for its Belt and Road Initiative, because with its geopolitical location in the Levant, Syria is important for China. But for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, surely he is more focused on getting the economic investments, but it is too early for China, and China does not like that investments, let's say. I think China's alignment with Iran and Russia, along with Syria, should be more worrisome for the Western countries, because we see an emerging bloc there, and what unites these countries is their joint resentment against the West and the US-led order. So this should be the topic that we should be concentrating on, and depending on the outcome of the war in Gaza, we would either reach a settlement or descend more into chaos.
Thank you. Sorry, any other questions you want to respond to?
There was one about Turkey's relation. First of all, I really do not take the Syrian-Chinese relations seriously. I can't. There is no state in Syria. There is a gang rapacious. There is no guarantee that they will not be just stealing the money that comes, if it ever comes, and I doubt that the Chinese would send any money. This may very well be a way for the Chinese to actually strengthen their relations with Iran, maybe a favor to Iran, rather than investing in a country that doesn't function, where security depends not on its domestic and its government, but on the existence of different forces. And after Gaza, I also wonder, again, these are questions, but I don't know the truth. After Gaza, will the Chinese be as sure that things are going? I mean, if Gaza really disrupts the equilibrium as such as it was that existed, the Chinese are pretty cautious. I doubt that they will move forward anytime soon. Now, Turkey's Achilles heel, of course, is Idlib. And it is, and I don't follow it that very closely. I mean, let me first confess to that. But I don't think that it truly, fully controls all all the parties that it supported and it does support fully. Moreover, gradually the Russians have moved their influence to the north, and all those Turkish ports are now actually hostages. And unless we remove those poor soldiers, God knows what may happen to them. And every time Turkey does something which displeases the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or whomever, they protest. And these guys have guns, and they're not necessarily very nice guys either. So Turkey is trapped there. And if the Russians one day decide, or the regime decides to really hurt Turkey, they will do something far more serious than what they've done in the past few weeks on Idlib. And then we will be faced with the potential of 2.5 million people, or at least 1 million of them, once more coming to our borders. So I think that's really a very delicate and a very fragile thing. And that's why, as she said earlier, if you pull the wrong brick, the entire Gazan wall may actually collapse, and we will not know what the result. We cannot predict what the result will be.
Thank you. Wayne.
Yeah, so there was a question about the US-Iranian relations. I think after the elections, what we didn't expect, and but also Israel around the war on Gaza. I mean, it's very difficult to predict the US policy here in position, but I would say that when there were negotiations with Iran and when Europe was negotiating with Iran, Iran was behaving in a better way in the region. It wasn't playing that, very, very spoiling role everywhere. So we would hope there would be a resumption of negotiations, and Europe and Iran, and maybe Europe at some point, whatever issues they have, I mean, if they're.
But the negotiations between Iran and the US failed.
Yes, so I'm hoping there will be resumption, rather than continue to face each other in Syria or in Iraq or somewhere else, just, talk business directly, But on the issue of war in Gaza, I mean, we don't hear much about what's happening in Syria a lot in the news anymore, but there've been always attacks on Iranian targets in Syria by Israel continuously, and that has increased after the war in Gaza, and they became very, very targeted, not just on military targets, or for example, if they know there is a military shipment coming to the airport, they'll go and hit the airport, but also on leadership. So they've been very targeted attacks on in Masjid, inside the hospital, in the middle of the market, where they got somebody inside his living room, and not just somebody, the whole kind of Iranian team. There was one in my house in Paris also very recently, where actually, it's also important to mention this, there was an Iranian team who wanted to live in homes, but nobody wanted to rent them a flat, nobody wanted to give them a house. And then eventually a lady, submitted to a very, very lucrative offer, and they rented them the flat, and as a result, the Israeli came and just targeted the flat, the whole building fell down. And the lady who rented them that flat was died also. So the people in homes were like, we're sorry for everyone who died, but not the Iranians, and not that lady, because she rented the flat to the Iranians. And now no one would let them, stay anywhere near them. But the point is that, they're targeting them more and more since then. And again, that's another thing against the Iranian presence inside Syria, that they're not protected by there, and Russia, that is meant to be their ally, is not protecting them.
I read somewhere Iran has got the largest number of military bases in Syria. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, but they're not exposed open military bases like the Russians want, nothing like that. Not really. There was a question also about the Turkish influence on the Syrian opposition, right? So depends on which opposition you're talking about. So if you're talking about the middle-aged men in gray suit who go around, they're useless. That's probably not. I mean, they have no impact, no legitimacy. They've been appointed, and their role is just to go to official meetings and but they're slightly more influential kind of level, which is more on the play of the governmental level, like the areas in the north of Syria, northwest, especially around Aleppo, Afrin, the guys who run the local councils, even the interim government, the head of the interim government, they are more influential, but they're influential in implementing Turkey's agenda inside Syria. They don't really work for their own people. And then there's, of course, the armed groups, and these are, again, they're doing the same thing. They're just implementing the Turkish agenda in the worst way possible.
We've come to the end of the time that we have, 7 o'clock. I'm sure if anybody's desperate to ask our speaker something, you can come after you formally closed. So on that point, I will finish. I'll start thanking you, the audience, both in person and online, for your questions and interest in this discussion. But above all, of course, I want you to join me in thanking Reem, Sully, and Celine for fantastic presentations.